Welcome to Hoodwinked with Dr. Mara Einstein, where we pull back the curtain on marketing scams, culty brands, and the tricksters trying to separate you from your money and your mental health. What is a cult that pretends not to be a cult? Is it capitalism? The military? Sororities? What if I asked you to think of a brand cult? For many of you, I bet Apple comes to mind. People who buy Apple products are lured by the illusion of better technology. They're unable to leave because of the walled garden, and Steve Jobs is their charismatic cult leader, even after he's long gone. But it's not just Apple. It's Disney, Lululemon, or Orange Theory. It's Trader Joe's, Dollar Shave Club, or Zappos. The list is endless. But becoming a brand cult, a product that consumers are not just passionate about, but also devoted to, has become the North Star for today's marketers. And with us today are two smart and savvy marketing executives who will help us understand the brand cult phenomenon and introduce us to the concept of brand movements. Chris Kneeland is the co-founder of Cult Collective, a marketing advisory firm headquartered in Calgary, Alberta, as well as the co-founder of The Gathering, cultgathering.com, a Forbes top-rated business conference. Chris has worked with top cult brands like Harley-Davidson, GoDaddy, Keurig, and John Deere. Ali Demos is Group Strategy Director at StrawberryFrog, a creative and strategy agency where she leads brand planning on Northwell Health, Four Leaf Federal Credit Union, and others. Ali has also been a hands-on cultural researcher. Her work spans from researching masculinity and law enforcement to Bollywood and the cult of Hindi movie stars, to the paradoxes of gender identity in the highly secretive community of Boston area crossdressers. Broadly, we think of cults as aggressive and derogatory, while we think of movements as positive and supportive of social justice. Are cults and movements at opposite ends of the spectrum in the brand space? Let's see if our cult brand expert and our cultural anthropologist contrast, or maybe find some agreement. Chris, I really want to start with you. You're behind this thing known as The Gathering. And so can you explain to people what The Gathering is and what that has to do with brand cults?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, The Gathering was created a dozen years ago as a celebration of cult brands and really trying to change the dialogue from cults being maybe creepy, nefarious things to sometimes people would use it like, oh, that's a great cult classic movie, or that's a great cult rock band. And a lot of brands that were capturing the hearts and minds of consumers, we just affectionately labeled a cult brand using the most positive connotation of a cult possible, which is just aggregating a group of people who have a very intense devotion to a particular product, brand, ideology, whatever it might be. So we really leaned into, I think, the provocativeness of the word, but more importantly, it was to lean into the playbook. Like, aren't you curious how Harley became Harley, or Apple became Apple, or Starbucks became Starbucks? Because the reality is we think most brands are remarkably unremarkable. They're doing very traditional, boring, mediocre things, and cult brands are doing awesome things. And so we were like, why don't we just show people what they're doing so that some of those plays, for lack of a better word, those tips, those tricks, those tools could be applied to a much larger audience. So yeah, we hold cult brands in very high regard and think of them actually as role models that most other brand leaders should try to emulate.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit later about what are some of the strategies and tactics that brand cults use. But even the ones that you talk about, in terms of, Apple or Harley-Davidson or something like that, there have been academic articles written about those going way back. But it's really expanded now. It's not just the small group of people that are, or brand companies that are brand cults. So can you give examples of some other ones and why you would call those brand cults?
Yeah, it's a great observation. In fact, at our 10th year, when we were honoring the most cult-like brands of the past decade, and you end up with like Barbie and the NFL and Porsche, you're like, these aren't small niche categories anymore. These are just some of the greatest brands on earth. And so we've actually relabeled it 2 years ago, where it's no longer cult brands. They're just what we call now part of the brand Hall of Fame. And so they really have gone much more mainstream. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to lose the quirkiness and the specialness. You take a brand like Lego, and I don't know that people on the street would call it a cult brand because it's just so pervasive and it's multiple billions of dollars. And yet they still think of themselves as catering to very small niches of consumers and really fueling hyper levels of loyalty with things like master builders. And as an example, 10,000 people that are, I call them freaks. But again, I use provocative language in a very flattering way. I think it's great to be a brand freak. I think people that take their Jeeps out and jump over crazy things in the woods are freaks. That's a $50,000 piece of machinery that you're going to destroy, but yet the cult of Jeep is amazing. So again, I still I agree that some of this, there's sometimes a belief that you outgrow, that as In-N-Out Burger becomes pervasive, or as Chick-fil-A, it stops being a cult brand. But that may be true if somebody had some pure definition. But I think in the hearts and minds of the people who are running them, they're trying to cling to the things that kept them very special to a smaller group of people.
Right, exactly. So, Ali, I know that StrawberryFrog is really known for cult movements as opposed to brand cults. So can you explain what a brand movement is and how that might compare with a brand cult?
We really take our cue from social movements. The spirit of common values, a common, might be ambition, might be a common grievance, but there's common ground that is shared between, let's say, a brand and its audience. And I think what that can do at its best is it can give real voice and power to individual people who on their own might not be able to be heard on a larger scale, but that with the collaboration of a brand can actually make a much larger impact. I think cults, from what Chris is saying, I think cults and movements share a lot of DNA. I sort of think of my own personal associations with cults are that they're a little bit more top down. There's like a leader of a cult, and a movement can be a little bit more democratized or collabed, if you will. And there can be a sense of co-creation between a brand and its movement members. And there's also, I think, as Chris was describing too, there's room for evolution. Like any good social movement, it's not a once set and done. It's sort of, how does it move through time with the evolving culture and all the rest. But it can be a way of just harnessing tremendous energy, both for an interested audience and for the brand itself.
So can you give me an example of a brand movement? Because I think people have ideas in their heads of what a brand cult is, but I don't think they have an idea of a movement.
I mean, I can give you one that's well known, and then I can give you one that is germinating right now.
Okay.
I think a well-known one might be REI's Opt Outside movement. And as you know, the store is closed on Black Friday, and that's kind of what I would think of as an iconic action on behalf of the brand, to say, don't be distracted from real life by sort of excessive consumerism. And I think that message appeals to who it appeals to, right? It's not everybody, but the people that are, I would say, part of the REI movement really respond to that. REI as a brand has done a lot of things it's not the one iconic sort of closure that is the whole thing. If you shop at REI, you're also a member and you get a membership dividend. There's a lot of pieces to it that make it feel as if there's common cause, I think, between the brand and the movement members. On the germinating side, there's a credit union on Long Island called Four Leaf that we're working with currently. If you know the history of credit unions, they often have sort of an affiliation at their core. So in the past, they might have represented a group of employees or state employees. The teachers' credit union is a famous one. Military credit unions are well known. Interestingly, credit unions have evolved, and they no longer you don't have to qualify to be a teacher or a soldier or an employee somewhere, but it leaves the sort of space open, like what should we be about, And so Four Leaf has really championed a movement called Money Like a Woman. It's really about embracing and celebrating women's economic muscle, both in the household and in the boardroom. It's an inclusive movement. It's for, celebrating women's collective achievement and everyone who loves them kind of thing. But it was interesting when we talked to our extended audience, both internally and externally, because I think there was some hesitation, at least initially, like, oh, are we, is it too narrow an audience? And then when you realize that women are 51% of the population, it's sort of the largest affinity group you could ever sort of market to or share a common cause with. So anyway, we're just getting that one up and running. But again, it's a moment in culture. You have from Caitlin Clark to the Eras Tour by Taylor Swift, you have women sort of driving sports viewership and changing the economic picture that the Fed tells just based on tourism and spend revenues and the markets she performed in. So there's kind of a groundswell happening, and a brand, I think, that can look at that moment in culture and say there's something to celebrate here, something to champion. That can be also the starting point of a movement.
So why is this different than like when I worked on Miller Beer way back in the day, right? I worked on Miller Lite. We did the Tour de Light, and people had to pretend that they were following along with this bicycle tour around the United States and whatever. What is the difference between creating a cult brand and just doing straight out, go buy our product? And why is that happening now? Let me start with you, Chris.
Probably there's a lot of discussion in the marketing and branding community about brand purpose. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it's disingenuous because at the end of the day, most organizations, regardless of what they say, what they do is their purpose is to pursue and maximize profit. And I think part of what Ali's talking about is there are some organizations whose purpose transcends transactions.
Right.
And they're few and far between. That's why we are so fascinated by it. I want to learn more, Ali, about some of your anthropological work, because I view myself, like, people ask me who one of my favorite role models is. They always say Jane Goodall. Like I like to think of myself as going into the wilderness and just studying human apes, but in this case, they're CMOs and CEOs and seeing how they actually behave and their behavior. Like if I think of a brand, I mean, the one that everybody talks about is Patagonia, although the one they used to talk about was Ben and Jerry's. But the whole B Corp, where there's a purpose beyond profits, it doesn't have to always be saving the planet. There could be, I love, are you guys familiar with Lush, the cosmetics and so? Mm-hmm. That to me, that's a social activist brand that happens to sell soap. They exist to do something bigger. I think to answer your question directly is, if I'm just Miller Lite, I think you can steal plays from movement makers, but you're there to sell more Miller Lite. You're not there to transcend or have something else positive happen in the lives of your marketplace.
Yeah, no, my boss used to say we're trying to sell so much beer that our consumers' livers will bust.
Not the best headline, but yes.
No, it's not.
I like the honesty of that.
No, but Lush is a great example. And I often use that in talks that I give, especially one of the things they just recently did, which is they closed down their stores in the UK for a day in protest against Gaza, so that the tax revenue from their stores would not then go to support the military. So they've been really true to form in terms of that. And I like the way that you put this, Chris, because it really made me think in terms of what Ali was saying, because it does sound like what you're talking about is this sort of embedded purpose marketing within these brand movements. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I think my last point, and Ali's probably a bigger expert on movement making, but a lot of what we see, a lot of what Airbnb did back in the day was copy the playbooks of the Obama administration's first run for presidency in terms of social change and social move. They considered themselves movement makers. And that also implied lots of very grassroots, guerrilla marketing kinds of things, pressing of the flesh and nurturing community. And, obviously Airbnb is one of the most iconic success stories of the past 20 years. And I just think it's interesting that they didn't look to like Marriott's marketing playbook. They looked at the Democratic National Convention's playbook.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I would also say that activism is an interesting word. Commitment is an interesting word, because to Chris's point, brand purpose, I think, can be a narrower meaning, but a commitment, something that a brand actually cares about, sometimes setting a goal out there in the world. Let's make New Jersey the healthiest state in the nation. Let's achieve pay equity in finance. And it's a what we call a BHAG, a big, hairy, ambitious goal. And you may not get there, tomorrow, next year, but you've set your sights high. And if you put that goal out there as a brand, you can rally people to join you who care about that issue. And as long as it's genuine, I think, Chris, you were getting at this too, with sort of, are you just kind of pulling a fast one on people and saying that you like a certain cause, or is it really core to how you see your future? A good example of that, I think, was when CVS as a brand was really rethinking its presence in the market. And they were doing a lot of things with minute clinics. They were really leaning into health. And they took a step back and said, would a healthcare brand sell cigarettes? And the answer was no. And they took $2 billion off the top line of their business in the first year that they stopped selling cigarettes. And listen, they're still a for-profit business, but they had a commitment to health. They were redirecting the future of the company and the kind of company they wanted to be.
So should we be rethinking how we think about brand cults, that they're not really, trying to grab people by the throat so much, is that they're trying to lean in to what people care about?
I mean, I know less about the cult side of it. I'm sure Chris can speak to that. On the movement side, the goal is genuinely to connect with an idea that people already care about and an idea that the brand cares about. It's to find that common space where if we join forces, we can do more than either of us could do alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would second. I love that word care. I think finding causes, and a lot of brands, I think where they get it wrong is they try to find causes that they share equal enthusiasm for in a positive way, where in many cases, some of the best brand examples are causes that people want to fight against. So fighting against something can even rally people greater than fighting for something. So you take Swell water bottles had a very noble purpose about eradicating the use of single-use plastic water bottles. And that's what they would lead their annual report. Wouldn't be about how we're doing financially. It would lead with how are we doing in making a dent in the elimination of single-use plastic water bottles. But it doesn't always have to be noble. Like one of my favorite examples is Snickers. Snickers is eradicating hangriness. You're not you when you're hungry. And they're doing it in a super playful way. Southwest Airlines was eradicating the elitism of air travel so that they could democratize the skies. So I think some of the really fun examples doesn't have to be, something that's super noble or philanthropic. It can just be there's a thing that exists that we don't like.
That's a great point. I love that. Brands can be about joy. They can be about self-expression. They can be about all kinds of things that we don't traditionally put in the space of activism. But as long as it's genuinely something that other people care about, you can create a movement out of that.
So let's dig into the word cult a little bit. In other episodes, we've talked about, what are those things that make up a cult? Usually that's things like targeting vulnerable people, luring people in with deception, surrounding them with love bombing, and all of these things, pulling them in and then telling them later who they are. Of course, having a leader, usually a charismatic leader, creating in and out groups, and providing sort of an overall worldview that answers all of life's questions. That's kind of a very broad definition of how we think about cults. And there are certainly some aspects, not all, that marketers use that are similar to that. Obviously, targeting the vulnerable, though it may not be vulnerable so much as targeting people who are in need of your product, might be the way that marketers would talk about that. But let's get into, and I think, Ali, you're the one who can really discuss this, is, what are the roots of cult? And this is also always a question that people come to me. Don't you know that the word cult comes from culture? I don't always know how to respond to that because I'm not a cultural anthropologist like you. So I would love to know how you would explain that to people. And let's see if we can use that to sort of broaden out the conversation here.
That's a great segue, Mara, because it's true. I mean, if you look at the roots of the word, cult, culture, cultivate, those are all part of the same root. And the good side of that, or at least in our current worldview, the positive side of that is learning and growth, right? Like we don't come into the world with a fully formed understanding of who we are and how we fit and what's important. All of that is cultivated in us by the people that raise us and the education we get. So to the extent that culture does that, we all inherit a culture. That's part of what makes us human, but we also shape that culture. Culture is not a passive thing, and that's what makes it exciting and playable, if you will. I think when brands try to play a role in culture, they are participating in a very old process, which is how do we see ourselves? How do we express our values? How do we show who we are? How do we identify? What signifiers will help others place us in that context? From the beginning, I think brands have frustrated rationalist economic models because people behave irrationally with brands. And obviously, I think there are strains of economics now that try to take into account some of that irrationality. I'm thinking of Daniel Ariely and irrational rationality and that the behavioral economics, essentially. But if you think of a classic economic model of use value, brands are like the pixie dust that goes on top of that. They're not accounted for. And why would someone care? Well, because a brand is a system of meaning. It's a way that I can express myself.
Mm-hmm.
I express myself in the clothes I wear, the way I speak, what I listen to, all of that stuff. And brands play a very key role in that just by virtue of the fact that they signify, and we can all feel that. You can feel the difference between Nike and Under Armour. And there are, cultural, political, affiliation-based signs all around us. And we all process them half consciously all day when we meet people.
Part of the reason that brands have come in to fill the void is that there are these other cultural institutions that don't have the same kind of power on us that they used to. So people don't go to church the way that they used to, and that used to be a personal identifier. Or people don't work for a company like IBM for 30 years. So, I tell my students that, I used to work at MTV, and there's people I know who are still working at MTV 30 and 40 years later, and that they can't imagine having that be an identifier. So brands have come in to sort of fill that void. And so that's having that connection, having that brand identity, that brand cult, that brand movement connected to it is what makes sense for the reasons why they would use brands to identify themselves, right? One of the things that I do in my work is trying to sort of pull back the curtain of the marketing world for people who don't work in the industry. So when you're trying to create a brand or a movement, what are the things that you do? What are the things that you look at? How do you start at the beginning to say, I don't know, with Snickers or with the bottles that you were talking about? What is the thought process that goes through to create that kind of a campaign?
So we've got about 13 years of trying to decode the most notable principles and attributes of a cult brand. And we've actually found 8 principles and 7 attributes. And the difference being a principle is a governing ideology or belief system versus an attribute would be a descriptive characteristic. So sometimes brands might try to copy the attributes, but they don't believe it. They're just behaving that way versus the people that inherently adhere to these same principles. I think they go further, faster. One is the creation of rites and rituals. So going back to the beginning of time, and you could certainly, like when I say that, sometimes you picture a Catholic mass with the robes and the incense and the chanting and the venue. And I'd be like, yeah, exactly. Think of that exactly, about introducing symbology, introducing language or lexicon, the whole stereotypical secret handshake or secret code words. Like, brands have those. Good luck trying to order in English at Starbucks. I just like a small black coffee. Like, they have their own names for their sizes. They have their own names for their brews. You look at somebody like Apple, who's a master of it. You don't just text, you iMessage, and you just and people shun the green bubble versus those that have the blue bubble, right? Like, there's just all these things that are woven into the experience that if you get it, if you know the secret menu, if you know how to get something animal style at In-N-Out, and you don't see that written, it starts to make you feel like an insider. It helps you identify other people that are part of that same clan. So I think brands could have a tremendous amount of fun thinking about what are the rites and rituals associated with how they use us versus others. Another one is called picking a fight. That's about being very intentional about who is your villain and how are you going to combat that villain. And this is, most brands don't do this because they're in the business of trying to please everybody. Picking a villain draws sides. American politics is the best example of a bad example, but it very much is us versus them. We're good, they're bad. And cults have sort of grown up being demonized and villainized. And so it's fun when you kind of get to do the reverse and start to demonize the other person or the other thing. And again, that doesn't have to be mean spirited. It could be Coke versus Pepsi, the Whopper versus the Big Mac, but it could also be something done a lot more playful. I work with a brand called Spikeball. It's a backyard game, and their villain is social isolation amongst teenagers.
Oh, that's great.
And the rising epidemics of, teen suicide. And so their whole mission is to find your circle and to get kids out and to interact with each other and do something active. And then the last one, which I wrote down because Ali mentioned the word earlier, is co-creation. I do think that there is a difference between a traditional cult and a good cult, and that is they tend to be less leader-led. Yes, Steve Jobs was put on a pedestal. Maybe Jeff Bezos is put on a pedestal, but that's the exception, not the rule. The best brands like Vans shoes, they couldn't even tell you who is the president of Vans shoes, right? They're much more about the community, and what the brand did so well was give them a microphone, give them a voice, and say, we value you for your dollar, but we also value you for your input and for your community and your participation. So great brands kind of give their brand over to the community and say, we want to be part of this, as opposed to trying to control it or dictate it.
This sounds to me what you're talking about, Chris, is we used to talk about brand communities in the early 2000s, and pretty quickly people started talking about brand cults. And it almost sounds to me like we're getting closer back to that idea of brand community as opposed to brand cult, because we've eliminated the leader and the hierarchy. Is that what the kind of thing you're saying?
I would not be offended if somebody thought of themselves as like, I think of YETI as a great community-led brand. They go into the fishing, hunting, camping communities and try to add value. So I think that would be getting down to almost an academic nuance of definition versus the spirit of what we're talking about is serving a group of people with common interests and an irrational desire to commit to something.
We have a similar, in the movement world, when Chris, you mentioned picking a fight, our version of that is called for and against. It's a little bit more movementy. So if you pictured yourself, your brand, you were at a demonstration, what are you for and what are you against? Because vagueness and pleasing everybody, you mentioned that too, Chris, it's not, no one's going to remember you or care. There is a bit of, put a stake in the ground. What do you stand for? And a movement framework can really put that in the forefront. The other piece, the other tool that we use is it's called Idea on the Rise. And it's a little bit trying to put out our cultural antennae and say, like, what ideas are percolating out there in the culture. They might be a little bit niche, or they might be a little bit inchoate, or they might not have gelled fully. But what are we seeing if we connect some dots that feels like there's a groundswell of energy, interest, commitment, however you might want to phrase it, and it's actually genuinely shared by the brand? Because once you find an idea that's on the rise, people want to be a part of something bigger than themselves. I think that's a fundamental human feeling. And when a brand can offer that, that's a powerful connection that typically endures for a long time.
Are there brands that can't fall into this framework? Like, are there brands that just, could never rise to the level of a movement or a cult?
I mean, I think brands that don't have any commitments would not be good candidates for I mean, there's a lot of caution in the marketing world. There's a lot of brands that basically aspire to look like other brands in their category. There's a wonderful stat that Millward Brown, which is you probably know, a famous brand testing entity that's been around for decades. They have a fantastic statistic, which is that if your brand is not the category leader and you market in what's called a category normative way, meaning your look, your voice, your colors, your imagery, your story sounds a lot like other brands in the category, about half of the money you spend will be misattributed to the category leader. So that's just a financial argument for standing out, doing something meaningful, making a statement that someone might remember. Most brands don't take that opportunity, I would say. But brands that have thought about it and taken a hard look at what their marketing dollars do, I think it's sort of an unmissable point.
Yeah, I have found, well, just to answer your question, I think that I would prefer you had asked, are there certain leaders that could never achieve cult-like status? Because the brand is simply a reflection of the people at the top. And yeah, most of them won't, because they're chasing other objectives. They're suffering from short-termitis. They're trying to win a quarter or win a month, or they're answering to shareholders who only care about financial returns. And cults stand, I like to say, they like to make a dollar, but they also like to make a difference. And typically as brands get bigger, even if they started with something noble, it turns into, it gets ruined, as they, even like Ben and Jerry's, once it gets bought by Unilever and it stops being special. So I do think there's a lot of leaders who would love to reap the benefits of cult-like status, but just would never display the courage or the discipline to do that cult brands do. We have seen a few categories, though. So I hate to mention it, because I think that the greater evil is a brand category that has tremendous cult-like potential, and they've dismissed themselves thinking that they don't. That's the far bigger sin, versus brands that are trying to chase cult-like potential, but they're just fighting an impossible battle because their category is, like, I've seen cult brand potential in gas stations. We've seen it with water. We've seen it with utilities, right? Some of these really basic commoditized services. But yeah, there's a few things around government, around B2B professional service. Like, it's really hard to find a cult-like business accounting firm.
Yeah, it's possible.
It probably is possible, but it's an uphill battle, because consumers do not have a pre-existing emotional affinity for those categories. The need is so functional that there's not a lot of room for fun or other noise to get into the system. And so I like to say most brands can become much more cult capable than they are today, but not all brands. And I would hate to try to lead somebody astray to go on a fool's errand to do something that would be really unlikely.
So answer the question I didn't ask you, Chris. What is the category that's not going in there that should be?
I'll use the example of gas stations that we just had. I think so many people, like, one of our largest clients right now is a large gas station chain in Canada. And they have so much, people have this weird, whenever I see irrational behavior, I always like to see what's going on. If somebody that drives 3 miles out of their way to save 3 cents on a liter or a gallon of gas, that doesn't make any sense, right? They're driving more gas than they're going to save. So it's such a price conscious category. But if you spent time in the Northeast and are familiar with Wawa and its affinity for those local particularly in Philadelphia, or if you spent time in Texas and have ever seen Buc-ee's, which is like Disney, if Disney had a gas station chain, it's ridiculous what's going on at Buc-ee's. You start to realize people will go out of their way, not just to save, but maybe even to spend more because they want to be a part of that community, or they want to be able to experience that novelty. They want to be able to be associated with what that brand represents and stands for. So I love it when somebody calls up and is almost apologizing. I'm not sure we can actually be cult-like, but could we? We're helping a company that does home electricity, like your electric bill. Yeah, you could actually create something that lets people care more about using you despite being a higher kilowatt per hour provider.
Yeah, I would even generalize to the point of saying any category that can be disrupted can have a movement. So if you can think of a disruptive application, whether it's I need more transparency on my electricity bills, or I need to have fun while my dad is pumping the gas. Those could be genuine disruptions in the way people use a category today. And if once that's possible, it opens up the space for, again, affinity, identity, choice, long-term loyalty.
So let me ask you both, what is your favorite example of either a cult brand or a cult or a brand movement, either one you've worked on or you haven't worked on? And what is it about that particular brand that you think is so special, or what they've done that is particularly spectacular?
Well, I can tell you about one that I work on. There is a large healthcare system headquartered in Long Island called Northwell Health. I don't know where you guys are located, but you might have.
I'm in New York. I know it well.
So we have co-created a movement with Northwell called Raise Health. You can hear the echo with Raise Hell, which is intentional. And the idea there is to say that we've all accepted a status quo in healthcare that is subpar, and we got to aim higher. We have done work with them on gun violence prevention, which, as you know, is a very tough topic for anyone to talk about without picking a personal fight. It's so easily politicized, and it gets very divisive very quickly. The movement that we have sparked with them is called It Doesn't Kill to Ask. And the idea, it's focused on access to an unlocked gun. So once you shift the conversation to access, I don't care who owns the gun. I'm not talking about ownership. I'm just asking, is there an unlocked gun in the house that my kid is about to visit? And so originally this movement was targeting parents to just say, we did a little primary research to back this up, which showed that most parents had not asked another parent if there was an unlocked gun in the house, but that about 90% of parents would like to know if there was an unlocked gun in the house. So that's a great space for a movement.
I've seen the ad. The ad is very good.
You know, it's a piece of language. It's a movement. It's trying to change behavior, but it's not a massive change, right? Because when you drop off a child at another parent's house, you might talk about allergies. You might talk about pets. You might talk about pool access.
Right.
Whatever it might be. There's already a list of questions that, parents are going to discuss. So this is about adding a question that might save a life. I'm very proud of that work. And we were able to show that people who were exposed to this message were 2.5 times as likely to ask the question of another parent. So we'd love to think that some lives were actually saved.
Yeah, that's great. Chris, what about you?
Costco. I would love to have been in the boardroom or the Shark Tank pitch where somebody says, okay, here's the idea. We're going to build a 200,000 square foot facility. We're going to charge people for the right to even come in and shop there. We're never going to have the same thing in the same place for more than a week or two. We're going to accuse everybody of stealing on the way out of the door and make them line up for a queue and look at their receipt. We're going to have a weird little section where we're going to sell hot dogs to people that are coming through. We're not going to have any merchandising. We're just going to open up boxes and put them on shelves and have people rummage through. Like, there's just nothing about that business model that somebody would say, that sounds like a good idea, because it breaks so many rules of how Best Buy or Home Depot or Kroger have trained us how to shop at retail. And yet It's one of the most fanatical following fan bases. They do not traditionally advertise. You're never going to see Costco Super Bowl commercial, right? It's actually got the third largest magazine subscription rate in America in terms of their quarterly newsletter that goes out. And I just love everything about their culture. They're a great place to work. They pay above average wages. They have ridiculous hours. They're almost like banker hours in terms of, trying to go there at at 9 o'clock and it's closed at 6 kind of a thing. But it's just, I love how non-conventional it is, and yet it just seems to work. And everybody that goes there loves it.
I think the membership thing is so key. It's, because you pay for that membership and you've got to show your card. It's like, I'm part of the club, and there is that, I get frustrated sometimes because I go back to try and find the thing that I liked 2 weeks ago and find out that they don't have it anymore, but it doesn't keep me from shopping there. That's for darn sure. So yeah, it's great. So what is the difference between a brand that's a cult or a movement versus one that has just a really strong fan base, or are they the same thing?
I mean, I think of a strong fan base as good raw material for a movement. It's certainly necessary. I don't think it's sufficient. I would argue that if you haven't activated or touched something that is important and meaningful for that group, and again, doesn't have to be socially valuable, but just emotionally important, even if it's a strong fan base, the connection is a little bit more incidental than it would be if there was a movement ethos that came to it. But I'm curious to hear Chris's thoughts too.
I think of a fan base would be an attribute or a symptom of something that could have cult-like potential, because clearly something special is going on. So it's kind of like that idea of A equals B and B equals C, but A doesn't equal C. I think that was, I didn't do well in high school algebra, but you can't have a cult brand that doesn't have a strong fan base, but you can have a lot of brands that have a fan base that I wouldn't say are cult brands. They could be popular. And the other attribute I'd throw into that is time. Like when we look at brands for the Brand Hall of Fame, you don't even get to be nominated until you're 25 years old. So does TikTok have a cult-like following right now? It sure does. It's like there's something really interesting happening with TikTok, but it's 6 or 7 years old. Let's talk about TikTok in 2 decades, and then we'll start to see if there's something. We like to think that cults can endure through changes in leadership. Everybody thought Apple was going to erode after their leader died, Steve Jobs. And so Tim Cook, to his credit, kept it alive. So right. I think a lot of these things are judged through the lens of history. Levi's and Coca-Cola, these are almost 200-year-old brands.
I'm glad you brought up TikTok, actually, because I've thought a bit about the social media platforms and whether those are, to your point, cult brands or movement brands. And I think what complicates it is that there's an addictive quality and that people are quite ambivalent about that addiction. Many people are. So it feels a little bit less to me like what I'm thinking of when I think of actual collaboration and co-creation, where we're building something together that we both have a hand in and we both feel strongly about, as opposed to you've got an algorithm that won't let me off this damn thing.
But to that point, Ali, I agree with you. However, we've looked at TikTok, and where it's the most cult-like is in the creator community who is leveraging it for their livelihood.
That's a good point. There's a subset.
Versus most people are just consuming TikToks, not creating TikToks. And those who rely on it have a much higher affinity. Same with like Airbnb. The hosts are the cult followers, not the Kneeland family that rents one twice a year kind of a thing.
That makes sense. Yeah.
What is the benefit or not for consumers to be engaging with cult brands rather than just buying a product off the shelf the way they used to?
Well, I can speak a little bit to the movement side. I said earlier that I think a brand movement can actually give voice and amplitude to consumers in a way that would be very hard to do on their own. So I do believe that in those instances where a brand connects genuinely with something meaningful for people, those people might not have been able to advance that value or that complaint or that grievance or that goal or that crazy ambition without the brand. So I think there is definite value added there. That said, movement participation is not passive and it takes energy. And so there are lots of other things in life that we want to give our time and energy and resource to. And so I would never sit here and tell you that, you know, a day well spent is a day investing in 4 or 5 different brand movements. You know, I think we have to pick our battles and pick the things that are most key to us. And there are going to be many categories at any given time where I'm a simple consumer and that's where I'm going to leave it.
Do people who get involved with movements get involved in multiple brand movements, or do people tend to focus on one versus another, say?
That's a good question. I don't have any primary research on that. I think my gut would tell me that if you are an engaged person, your feelers are out for brands that are making noise, and not just indiscriminate noise, but speaking to you in a way that, you know, picks a cause or picks a fight. I think probably some people are just more alert to those signals than others. So my guess would be that if you've been switched on in that way, you might be receiving more signals than someone else.
If somebody gets involved with a brand movement, so they're not just going to the store and buying the product, so they're engaging somehow with the movement. So what does that entail?
It could mean changing your behavior. Like as Chris said, you could be driving out of your way to shop somewhere. You could be changing your behavior as a parent, asking another parent if there's an unlocked gun in the house.
Right.
You could be spending Black Friday kayaking down the river and thinking about, what am I going to do for the holidays? That is actually, you know, thinking a little differently about the holidays based on that moment that the brand opened for you. So I do think brands that have a movement commitment need to be creative about the ways that gets expressed beyond the moment of conversion or consuming the core product.
The last one I would add to that would be advocacy. When brands with great cult followers do something wrong, it's amazing how well their community comes to their defense, and or it could be, I forgive you. I think of the Lululemon community when, you know, the CEO says overweight women shouldn't wear Lulus. Like, that was so offensive to that community because he was supposed to be one of them, which was about exclusivity and all the yoga Zen-like beliefs of beauties from within. And so that's why it became so polarizing. But whether it's Nike with what they did with Colin Kaepernick, or whether it was what we've seen with American Eagle or Cracker Barrel in the last 6 months about all this outrage over their rebranding and their advertising, like, one of the most things that you'll get from a great community is their voice, and they will weigh in. And but you'll also get their forgiveness. They want you. They're not blind in their devotion, but they are willing to give you the benefit of the doubt and a second chance. You mentioned earlier the demise of religion. We study that very closely because there is a correlation, a plethora of cult brands exploding at a time when participation in an organized faith is on the decline. I think what we've learned is that as a social species, we need a sense of belonging and an identity and a cohort. And if I can't get it from my church group, I'm going to get it from my something else. And I think that's really powerful. I think it speaks to the resiliency and the need of the human spirit to find something else. And if I actually wish it was more churchy. I think God does play a role in our society, but it's better than having a bunch of loners all living a very isolated existence.
The other note on that, though, is I wonder if it's a difference in degree and not in kind. And what I mean by that is going back 100 years when religion was far more central to people's lives, there were still brands that had cult followings. And so I think probably the point you guys are getting to is that maybe the proportionality has shifted. But I think this question of brands actually goes way back. And I don't think it's just only a product of the decline of spirituality.
and I've had this conversation with colleagues of mine, there was church merch in the Middle Ages. Right. So the idea of selling something related to religion is certainly right? not. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So it's not anything new. This has been a really wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you both coming because, one, it gives me faith in marketing again. And I always say to people, as much as I am a marketing critic, give me some good marketing and I'll be the first one to rally around it and say, yeah, this stuff is great. And I think it's really important. I think it's also important to, wrap ourselves around this idea that brand cults don't work the same way as, cults in the way that people have come to think about them. And one of the things that I've talked about before is the fact that cults in the 17th century were related to people who venerated a particular person or an ideology. And by the 19th century, it was not specifically related to religion, but there wasn't anything negative associated with that term. The negativity and the derogatory ideas around cults really, stems from what happened in the late 20th century. So the term itself doesn't have to have this baggage attached to it that I think a lot of people do. And I think what's been great about this conversation is I think we've done that. We've said that, some of these marketing cults and movements aren't necessarily negative things that people put on it. And for that, I really appreciate you. Is there any last words of advice or wisdom that you want to provide that I have not discussed so far?
I think I enjoy the provocativeness of the word. I'm not here to try to reclaim it and make everybody understand that cults are good, not bad. Because even if you just looked at the bad, it's still fascinating as students of just human psychology. How do otherwise reasonably intelligent, well-intending people fall for, how do they get hoodwinked into these types of things? And could those powers be used for good versus evil? My wife gave me a personalized license plate 2 Christmases ago called Cult Leader, because my agency is called Cult. And I was at Walgreens I've forgotten about it. It's just, it's on your car. How often do you look at your license plate? And this woman taps me on the shoulder. So I just have to ask, what cult are you the leader of? And I have to smile and say, you're going to be really disappointed with the answer. We're not sacrificing any virgins, and we're not, taking over any governments anytime soon. We're just a marketing agency. But I think what I want to do is help people realize, let's be a little bit more curious and a little bit less judgmental. That if we see something, don't just dismiss it as a one-off, but maybe rather ask smarter questions about how did they do that? Why did they do that? Is there something that I could learn from that might apply to my life, my relationships, my customers, whatever it might be? That's what most frustrates me the most, is that the broad brush sweeping away of if it's all good or all bad. And it's like, no, there's the genius is in the nuance and the application.
Yeah, I was going to just build on that to say that I think there was an era that maybe is 20 or 30 years in hindsight where marketers were seen as the great manipulators. And that may still, stay with us to some extent. But I do think that the world of movement marketing and cult brand marketing is more about co-creation, collaboration, collective action, joining forces in a way that can be positive for everyone who's involved. Persuasion is the oldest thing in the book. When we learn to speak, we learn to persuade. Like Chris was saying, you can persuade people to do very bad things, or you can persuade them, appeal to their better angels, and do something that means something for them and for their families and future. So I think it's the tool and it's the use you put to it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Mara. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, great to meet you both.
I hope this conversation gave you a chance to see how marketers think about brands, branding, and you, the customer. Every brand needs to stand for something in the consumer's mind, whether it is CVS standing for health or Southwest democratizing the skies. But lots of brands are pushing the boundaries to be brand cults or brand movements. Brand movements are embedded with values that consumers care about, while brand cults cultivate rites and rituals, like only being able to order coffee in Italian at Starbucks. Do you believe that brands can harness a movement? Should corporations do this? Are brands being disingenuous when they position themselves as being more than a profit-based transaction? And more broadly, should the word cult apply to innocuous things like brands? Send me an email through my website, drmaraeinstein.com, and let me know what you think. Subscribe to Hoodwinked with Dr. Mara Einstein on your favorite podcast app for new episodes every other Tuesday. You can follow me, Dr. Mara Einstein, on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Threads at Dr. Mara Einstein. You can pick up a copy of my book, Hoodwinked, How Marketers Use the Same Tactics as Cults, and please do, wherever you buy books. Hoodwinked is produced by Multitude. Our lead producer and editor is Bren Frederick. Thanks to Kayla Einstein for our cover art and Mark Langer for our theme music.